I'm going to talk about a very interesting topic called blackouts and whiteouts, where we assess internet infrastructure resilience under power grid failure. This work is done in collaboration with the ISOC Pulse Fellowship Program. My mentor is Kevin and Rish. Along with that, we are also working with Italo Cunha and Fernando Kuipers, who is my supervisor. Before we get into the topic, a bit about me. I'm Tanya Shreedhar. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Network Systems Group in TU Delft. I have some experience in working at these various universities and fortunate enough to get funding support from these amazing organizations to continue my research. My current research interests are in transport rail protocols, protocol operations, and internet resilience. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive right in. Blackouts. What comes to your mind when you hear the word blackout? I think shutdown, yeah. And I think this recent Iberian outrage put the blackouts and the risk of blackouts really on the map for at least our community. The interesting aspect of this blackout was that it lasted for a lot of hours. Spain declared a state of emergency and it cascaded not only to the region where it started, but across a lot of Europe. But if I tell you that blackouts are not a rare occurrence and they keep on happening again and again, would you believe me? But then why are they happening? Yeah, that's a reality of life. And so we also need to look at the reality of power grid. This is a brief primer given the audience that we have. Electricity grid consists of three different components: generation and storage, where the energy is generated via power plants, nuclear plants, renewable energy sources. And these are usually at very far away distances from where they're actually consumed. So they need to be transmitted via this very robust transmission system that we see, and we have seen all across there. They are ubiquitous, so to say, the first ubiquitous system to exist. And then, but to transmit across these large distances, there are these step-up substations that step up the generated voltage to a very high level so that it can be transmitted over these long lines without much loss of power. And then when they are ready to be distributed, they are stepped down and then distributed to industries, commercial, and residential places. But then this is a very robust old system. What can go wrong? Why are these blackouts happening? Any ideas? What can go wrong? Everything. Yes. Everything can go wrong, from equipment failures to demand and supply imbalances. This is something that happened. It may happen because of weather, extreme weather conditions, what happened in Spain. It can also be an human error. Natural disasters are always striking. And also there is an issue of attack on the grid. A bit more about this later. But what was interesting about this Iberian outage was this outage also led to a complete communication outage. And that is something that was unheard of in the recent times. So we have people here in the audiences who have looked at the impact of it. So Cloudflare Radar published a blog that almost 90% of the traffic volume went down. It also impacted. The interesting effect, so to say, of this outage was it not only impacted the regions where the outage happened, but also the neighboring countries. So, for example, in Morocco, the power was there, yet the internet was not there. And this is something that confused a lot of citizens. So I remember last talk, Ria said that it's all wireless, right? How can something that is not physically impacting you impact your network traffic? So this brings us back to the point that we need to protect our network operations. And so this another issue that can happen in this power failures is that internet cyber attacks can also cause wild scale power disruptions. So there can be these botnets that can connect to all these devices that are connected to the grid, turn them on at the same time, and bring the power down, which again can cascade it into an widespread internet failure. This can happen, and I'm not the only one saying this can happen. Actually, there's a lot of bodies, including the United Nations and European Union, looking at this cascaded effect that can happen in the power grid and the internet infrastructure. So now coming back to the point, like, why do we want to make internet resilient? Isn't it resilient by nature? Isn't it a network of networks which has a lot of cables all across the globe? Why do we need to make it resilient? So it's not only these network of cables, it is also these physical equipments and these infrastructures, which, like any other infrastructure, just like this building, work on power and draw a lot of power to work. So now this brings me to our main research question. How much of the internet operations is actually susceptible to failures in the power distribution network? For that, we break the susceptibility part into two levels, two granularities. One is at country and zonal level, the other one at a city and the local level. So we break this into three research questions. In first one, we investigate the dependence of IXP infrastructure on the local power stations, the ones that I showed you in the primer slide. Then secondly, we want to characterize these backup IXP peerings in case a failure of this sort happens. And then we want to uncover the impact on the local areas of such failures. For that, we divide this approach into three phases. The first phase, we look at the IXP facilities and power station dependency. This was done using OpenStreetMap and PeeringDB. For the second phase, we look at the IXP and the transit connection. After a failure has happened, we look at the peering testbed to get the results for that. In the third phase, we look at the city level AS impact due to these IXPs and power failures. So for this talk, I will be talking about those two phases briefly. Let's go to the phase one. Herein, we want to have an IXP facility and power station dependency mapping. So all of us in this room know that ISP facility information and the number of ISP hosted is easily available on PeeringDB. So we use that. But power station information, not so much. It is very difficult to have a standardized power station data that is released on some sort of a common platform. However, there is some richer data available for the EU. This is not shared in a very standardized format. It's not easily accessible or available. Additionally, even if we get this data, there is no feeder level topology available. That is, we don't know what is powering our ISP infrastructure. So for that, we go to multiple routes. First, we go to the OpenStreetMap data, and we collect this data set. The good thing about OpenStreetMap is it's openly available, has detailed geospatial information, has commits, a very recent commit. So anything new that props up, it's usually available in OpenStreetMap. But the issues with OpenStreetMap is the raw OSM data is actually extremely noisy, has a lot of inconsistencies and missing voltage tags. And more often than not, the raw OSM data is not very consistent with the operator level data, that is the transmission operators and the distribution operators. So to overcome that, we also collected some transmission systems operational data sets, at least in the Europe. So these are the companies whose data set we looked at. But the problem with the TSO data set is that it's very patchy. That is, it's not available for all the countries, even in the Europe. let alone globally. The formats are very inconsistent because they are country level. They don't match with even their neighboring countries. They might be published in very different years. They might be very old. They might not be updated. Sometimes it's just a schematic or an abstraction. And yeah, it's just a country level view for their operational needs and not a global tool to help researchers. So what do? We use the OpenStreetMap data to infer the substation information and then validate it with the TSO operator data. I will not go into the details of the inference approach we adopted, but please catch me in the break to get an overview of how we did it. But yeah, we did it. Here on the left is the map of the extracted substation, inferred extracted substation from the OpenStreetMap data. And we validated it with the tenet data. So this particular plot is for the Netherlands. And we validated it with the national level operator in the Netherlands, that is tenet. And we were able to achieve a 76% station map with a median distance of approximately 250 meters. I think it's pretty good, even if it is me who is saying that. So with that, we were able to have accurate geospatial information about the Netherlands-wide power network. We added the peering DB information, facility level information with the facility locations and the number of IXPs hosted in each facility. And we came up with a consolidated map of facilities and the power station information. So what we did was we did the first pass at a closest correlation to identify the distance-based risks for such facilities. The plot on the right shows the facility risk or an impact with respect to the number of IXPs that are hosted in that facility and the distance it is away from a nearest power substation. So from this map, we can already identify the top risky stations, which is Equinus, North Sea, Amsterdam, and just one in the Rotterdam. From this map itself, we can see that how vulnerable the Amsterdam area is. So if there was an attack to happen or a power outage to happen in the Amsterdam area, almost all of the infrastructure, IXP infrastructure in the Netherlands will be out. But we didn't stop at that because this might just be an abstraction that we have. These IXPs might be using a much more resiliency model. So we went to the K nearest resiliency approach, wherein we allowed the IXPs to be powered by 3 power stations, which is a very good overestimate of the availability of the power. With that, we created a bipower trade graph and we decided to do failure analysis. So for the failure model, we considered 3 different approaches. Degree-based failure, that is how connected a particular power station is. Betweenness-based failure, that is how critical the node is depending on how much it is coming in between 2 nodes in a graph. And then we did a simple Monte Carlo-based random failure with 1,000 runs, actually. So we say that a facility loses power if all of its backup, primary backup and secondary backup, all of them fail. That's only when a facility fails. So what I'm going to show you next is a series of station failures and how geographically the failure goes at least in this Netherlands case. So this is 0 substation failure, very nice looking green plot. Now, so for this particular simulation, I am using the degree approach. So if I fail 10% of the substations, we already see a lot of red here, and that's only 10% of the substations. We see one of these doomed out things shows that with this one particular substation, 10 of my IXPs are out. So what if I go to 20? This has now affected the entire Randstad area. So AMX IX is out, NLIX is out. And it's only if I go up to 60 that this spreads out. So basically, because of this co-location, it's very concentrated, even if an attacker was to attack only a small set of substations. Now, the detailed analysis for this on the y-axis, we have how many facilities are remaining online with the subsequent failures. And on the right, the plot shows how many IXPs are online with the subsequent failures. So the green line, the nice green line, is a random failure. So if the stations were to go out randomly, that is, a power outage was to happen at a random station, the impact it's not so bad. It's only after almost 50 or 60% of the stations have failed that we see that the facilities and IXPs actually start going offline. But the interesting phenomena is because of this coal, although at 20%, my facilities that are remaining online is close to 50%, but 70% of the IXPs that are available actually go offline only with 20% of the power failure. So the takeaways are very clear for us. We see a very strong evidence of cascaded failure risk between power delivery networks and this internet exchanges. The other thing is a lot of time the operators would say that we have an X number of IX facilities, and this is the reason why we are resilient. Or we would like to argue that this is the reason why they are not resilient. Yeah, the takeaways are clear for our phase one. So what we wanted to now do was, now given that these things have happened, the IXP has gone offline, where is the traffic going to go and how much? So for that, we went to phase two of our experiments where we looked at the IXP and the transit backup connections for these different IXPs using the pairing testbed. Pairing testbed is an open to use tool to conduct BGP experiments. Here, we can announce prefixes from all these vantage points and conduct experiment to see what the backup paths are. So continuing with the Amsterdam experiment that we had, we wanted to understand what happens when Amsterdam failed. We just took some vantage points that we had in the peering testbeds. So if Amsterdam region fails, both AMXIX and Vulture for our testbed goes out. So then what is the possible options that we have? One is that we might go to Frankfurt, but the other one is we might just not go to something nearby and go all the across to the ocean to Seattle. For the methodology, and how do we take that? For the methodology, what we did was we did anycast announcements from our peering sites, and we measured where the clients are routed to infer what are the preferred paths. Then we failed these two sites, as in that we withdrew announcements from these sites in this city, and now we want to measure where the clients will be routed to. That is, will they go to Vulture Amsterdam or will they go to Seattle? So the idea behind this experiment is to understand if they end up going to Vulture, will be able to, which is in Frankfurt, that is, it's geographically related, which is also our assumption, will it also uncover some dependencies between the NL power grid and the German power grid, given that Tenet is the operator for both of these countries? So this is still a work in progress. You can ask more about the results to me and Kevin in the breakout sessions. But with that, I want to conclude my presentation. The idea of this research and why we started doing this research is to increase the collaboration towards resilience from both these sectors, not only the internet sectors, but also the power sector. We want to improve transparency. We see that there's not a lot of transparency when it comes to these critical infrastructure operators. And we hope that by showing these experiments, we can issue some guidelines for regulation and policy development. We can get some people on board who might help us take this project forward. We want also something that we want to use is we want to use the learning from these past outages And we want to build a framework towards a more resilient internet. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Yes, we have a few here. Marinho Barcelos from Waikato. Suggestion is to work a little bit more on the motivation scenario because, for example, for IoTs, it's being demonstrated not everything is dark and gloomy. The paper 2019 is unique security. So they show that those botnets cannot collapse the grid. They can change the price of the energy, but they cannot collapse. Second thing, if an IXP goes out because of power cut, that could affect an outer region and then users would not have electricity, right? So what is the likelihood of an incident just with the IXP? And the third thing is colocation facilities and IXPs, they do not have their own power backup source, oil, something like that.
Okay, I'll take this in steps. First question, we do agree that right now it's not a problem, but we create this example scenario where all the botnets can attack the grid at the same time. Now, given that everything is becoming online, all the devices are smart, I don't think that this is a very hypothetical risk scenario anymore. For the second question, you talked about that end user is not getting impacted. So I think this is not true anymore. So for example, when this outage happened in the Spain, people could not communicate, people could not use the internet. So these co-location facilities also had ISPs operators. So your cell service will also go down. So it's not like end users are not going to get impacted at all.
So the question was, I mean, your motivation, your problem was just when the IXP gets a power cut. Because if everyone in Spain gets a power cut, then you don't care, right?
Okay, maybe I was not very clear about it. Like I said, outages have been happening for a long time. But what is becoming even more of a problem is if a power outage also results in a complete communication outage, given all of our lives are online now. None of us carries physical money anymore. So power source cut. So you were talking about resilience of the IXPs. For these co-location facilities, I actually looked at the guidelines that are needed to operate. So you need K+1 resiliency. So that plus one actually is coming from just generators. Now we all know that you cannot have generators that are working for days together. So that's not a very resilient model, so as to say.
Hi, I'm Nina. I built networks for 20 years. So I agree with my colleague over there. I think it's an interesting study. I think it's important to look at, but I think you need to go in and learn a little bit more about how data centers build their energy, because a data center will have at least two different lines in. They will have battery backup, they will have generators, they will have priority at oil companies to get the diesel when their generators are running out. What you're looking at is a really long outages if this scenario is going. So that was one point. Sorry, I have many points. The other one is I don't think you are giving a good picture of the consequences of what was happening by just looking at the IXPs. First of all, when you're looking at Amsterdam, you're looking at a lot of the IXPs are distributed IXPs, and they have POPs in different data centers. So if one data center fails, a couple of access switches from that IXP fail, but that's it. I think your study would be way more relevant if you're just looking at data centers, because then you're also covering all of that, which is, I'm sorry to say, the majority of the traffic on the internet that runs through the private interconnections between networks. IXPs are super important, but they are collecting the long tail, as we say. The majority of the large volumes of traffic are running through private interconnections between the networks. If I would recommend that you continue the work, but dig into how data centers are built and how they're connected to the grid and what they have themselves, and focus on data centers and not IXP.
Actually, I have looked at it and we have also talked to a few data center. So this K is equal to 3 resilience free model, like you said. Even if we go to the tier 4 level of resiliency for tier 4 data center resiliency, so you can have 2n plus 1. power lines. That is, for every element of the power, there is a duplication that has happened plus one generator. For our K resilient model, we went to 3. So that is exactly what we are highlighting. So we are even giving one off for our modeling. So if one of these events were to happen, our model will be valid for that. But as we know, a lot of these data centers are actually tier 3 resilience, which is N+1. So we did talk to a lot of these co-location facilities, and we have some insights on that. But yes, I will take your points into account and work on improving this model.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent talk. Thank you. First, it's a shameless comment that you should talk to Nishant, my student who also is a Pulse Fellow.
Yes, we did talk.
Okay, great. And I have a kind of similar comment about the private infrastructure, but from a different perspective, which is that the private infrastructure is actually putting a lot of pressure on the grid now, right? AI data centers are consuming a lot of energy and a lot of water. And so I guess my question is, where do you see that in terms of impacting, since you've studied public grids a bit as part of this work, is where do you see that going? Because the US government just announced that they're going to solve the problem of AI using too much energy by building more AI, which is incredibly frustrating. And then I have a comment about, I think, yes, IXPs largely deal on the long tail when it comes to revenue. Like I think most of our revenue is focused on the private infrastructure, but I think a lot of important services would probably be impacted by IXPs in a way that we just don't know yet, because IXPs just don't fail all that often.
Yeah.
And so I think you building this data set is a really good contribution.
Thank you so much. I think there can be a panel discussion on your first point, though.
I tried to get a panel discussion up in Apricot, which was held in Malaysia, basically because Malaysia is trying to be the hub of data centers and AI in Southeast Asia. Trying to get people from the infrastructure side is very difficult. Yeah, I agree there's the need to try and bring us all together to discuss this. And it's only been in the last month that Johor Bahru, which is the main state of Malaysia, which has been housing all these data centers or the growth of data centers, since there was a mandate on not building any more data centers in Singapore, they've actually stopped it now as well in JB because of they were thinking, actually, this isn't stacking up. The figures aren't stacking up in terms of power generation. I wrote something about this as well. Malaysia is not producing enough energy to be able to meet its demands.
Thank you for the cool presentation. I agree with most of the comments that my colleagues have done. Actually, I was wondering, if you ask IXPs, they will probably boast of their resiliency and actually tell you how much resiliency they have and for how long they can sustain it without the grid. But it is actually true and could be interesting to compare with other critical infrastructure that was brought down by one single substation that was not maintained for a decade, even though it was known that it was an issue. So yeah, it might happen. I was wondering, why don't you look at Ukraine, where there has been effort to disrupt its energy infrastructure and see which effect it has on the ability to exchange traffic, whether in IXPs or in PNIs?
That's a very good suggestion. I think I'll look into it.
Last question.
Okay. I agree with what was said about data center having power generator and stuff. But I think you gave the example of Spain, where you see that traffic dropped very quickly. And I've heard two different stories about Spain. So of course, a lot of people show those graphs and say, oh, they lost internet. But actually from the operator perspective, a lot of people, if you look at BGP, things are pretty stable. And so the backbone was still there. So that also, second, what was said, some colocation facilities were still working. So I think the problem was that a lot of these mobile station went down as soon as the power went down. So I was wondering if it's something you could add in your study, trying to have, there is some open, whatever cell IDs, you could add those. I don't know. Just trying to.
Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. Actually, we did look initially at the telecom power stations, but I think that's a beast of its own because of the magnitude that they have. And then trying to infer, especially for and when it comes to IXP, the fact that they have, I do agree, the fact that they have direct contacts with the grid operators, they are paying a lot of money. And that is the reason why I actually did abstract a lot of details that went into these inference modeling for OSM data. So that is the reason why they're placed very close by to the high voltage points. They have zero distribution variabilities. But when it comes to these telecom antennas, these are actually like operated by these distribution networks. That's a noise of a very different level. So yeah, but we did look at it.
Sorry, Machiki, we're going to close that now because everyone needs a coffee, and you're welcome to ask the question during that break. But thank you
Thank you so
Tanya.
much.